Good afternoon. I'm going to talk about Save the Children's experience over the last 5 to 7 years, looking at these issues of language, and particularly issues affecting dominant languages being driven to a population of children who don't have that language in their daily life. So a lot of the contexts where Save the Children works don't necessarily have English language teaching, but often to do with more indigenous groups who are struggling with going to school, which is using the national language as a medium of instruction. But a lot of the lessons are quite similar in terms of how you deal with that mismatch between the dominant language or the popular language and the language which children actually speak. So I'm just going to talk about this kind of project that Save the Children UK in particular has had on language and education, and the reasons why we developed more work in this, the problems we identified, how we approached these challenges, what we learned and how we responded, and some of the big issues that we still see affecting the work that Save the Children is doing. Yeah. So just in terms of terms, L1, first language, L2, second language, mother tongue, the first language that is used by and around children from birth, the language of children's early years and kind of everyday life. Not everybody has one mother tongue, and it can be increasingly complicated, but that's just kind of how we've been treating the term. And MTB-MLE is mother tongue-based multilingual education, which is where you start teaching in the mother tongue and you carry on as long as possible, but you're gradually introducing more content and more teaching in second language. So just so we're clear on our terms. So in 2003, we really identified that we had a real challenge with a lot of the work that was happening in teacher training work, particularly that Save the Children was doing. So we had countries which were moving out of poverty or out of conflict, increasingly moving towards English as a medium of instruction, and a sense of kind of wanting to catch up and wanting to take up economic opportunities, so making sure everyone had English, and also signalling allegiance with English-speaking donor countries in particular. And we were finding that often Save the Children was doing teacher training work in those countries, and in rural areas they were told how to do child-centred, competency-based teaching, but they often couldn't apply the messages in that training because children didn't understand the official school language. And that sometimes was a national language, sometimes that was an international language like English. So in some contexts, teachers didn't speak the same language as children because they were bussed in from a different area. Or they didn't know the official language that they were supposed to be teaching in. And so that meant that teachers found it easier to stay teaching by rote because they were kind of averse to communicating because the central medium was problematic for them. And in other contexts, teachers would code switch. They would switch between the official language they were supposed to be using and the language which they knew children would understand. And in some of the research that we did with children, a lot of them said they found this really confusing. It wasn't working for a lot of children. They found it, particularly teachers that switched back and forth every sentence or so, they found that very difficult. We also had a lot of contexts where there were kind of 2 or 3 years mother tongue education, for local language education, and a switch to English or a national language in upper primary. And we were finding that actually what was happening was that teachers were starting to teach in the L2, the English or the national language, right from the beginning, because they were like, I have to get these kids with enough English to switch to English in grade 4, so I've got to start now, because otherwise how can I possibly do it? So you had a lot of schools which were actually starting off using an English or a code switching approach, and not developing the mother tongue in the early grades at all. So that was a real problem for us. And so at that time, Save the Children was doing things like translating textbooks into local languages to enable easier mother tongue literacy, and encouraging, as part of the teacher training, encouraging teachers to do more communicative activities in mother tongue and to do more plays and songs and things like that in local languages, which made things less unpleasant for kids. Children were coming and finding a more friendly environment, but it wasn't really shifting in terms of learning outcomes. So we had this big challenge, and the teacher training that we thought would really fix a lot of the teaching wasn't happening in the way that we thought. So from 2004 to 2006, we sort of embarked on a process of really thinking and learning, like, what do we need to understand about the role of language in children's education? Because at that point, we didn't really have enough knowledge. So we did a lot of consultation on the blocks that we were seeing at local level. And really this kind of combination of sort of political and economic fears was people felt driving the policy and the practice around language. So in some contexts, like for example Vietnam, a fear that minority groups should be using Vietnamese at all times, otherwise they would be more likely to break away from the country, was really driving the approach of using Vietnamese to teach in primary schools. Also this sense that a foreign language or a national language is the magic bullet to drive the economy forward was very, very powerful. And that if you didn't start early with English, you were going to be left behind all those other countries that had good English skills. So a lot of anxiety around policy. Agencies who talked about having more mother tongue-based approaches were seen as wanting to take second language away. The idea being that you can't have both, that if you have less mother tongue, then that means, if you have more mother tongue and less English, then you're losing something. You're not going to get your outcome of having the dominant language. So if you ally yourself with the mother tongue group, then you're seen as unpopular because you're suggesting not having English. And with all these issues, we realised that Save the Children's ability to operate in a lot of countries would be under threat if we openly challenged these beliefs. In some countries, it was more of a sensitive issue than others, but certainly we couldn't just say the policy is wrong, the evidence says it won't work. We had to be a lot more subtle and we had to work in slightly different ways. So dealing with these kind of intangible drivers but trying to get a practical change, we started to think about, well, what could we say and how could we engage with people who had these fears about language? Another key issue was a lot of donor staff didn't understand why language should be a priority in education aid. So we would raise this issue and the response would be, well, yeah, it's an additional issue, but we don't really see it at the centre of what we're doing. You know, the donor agencies didn't really see what their role was in promoting good language practice. And we had a lot of confusion in terms of the technical approaches about what actual approaches were best, particularly at the kind of district mid-level of education officials. So there was this kind of sense of having to choose between two opposites. You know, did you have sort of an immersion in, say, English? Because that was what was used for kind of immigrant populations in developed countries. There was a lot of talk about a study in Canada where they'd used an immersion approach for English, and that was something that had really spread to a lot of the partners we were working with in developing countries. But then if teachers don't know English, how can you have an immersion approach? And you know, how does that work? And what do you do when you haven't got much money and you don't have many materials? On the other hand, if you have mother tongue education, that's very empowering for Indigenous groups, and in some contexts that was popular. But then, isn't it disempowering not to give Indigenous groups the same chance of getting English as everyone else? So that was a big problem. So this is often, people kind of ended up in a compromise position, thinking, well, maybe if you have these early exit bilingual, where you have kind of 2 or 3 years of mother tongue, and then you switch to English, maybe that's the best compromise between these two extremes. And what we were finding was that there was plenty of evidence, particularly the Kathleen Hugh work from Sub-Saharan Africa, showing that the early exit bilingual, really the gains from that were being lost after a couple of years. So early exit approaches weren't really working. So this is what kind of people's anxieties were. So we started to kind of strengthen our links with academic institutions, and we found that there was a lot of evidence of bad practice, widely available, but not really understood why it was bad practice. And there was a lot of evidence of good practice in developed countries, but very little in developing countries, in complex multilingual settings, particularly in post-conflict settings. Although SIL International had increasingly produced a lot of much stronger evidence on what can work, and particularly the SIL work in the Philippines found it was actually very useful in terms of looking at what approaches would be appropriate for developing countries. So the message we were taking was, if you don't have a good foundation in your mother tongue or a familiar language, you're not going to be a good learner. And this is the Jim Cummings message. The predictor of capacity in your second language is your capacity in your first language. And in a lot of places, it seemed to us that having English as a medium of instruction made a lot less sense than good quality teaching of English as a second language. Why do you, if you want people to be good at English, why do you need to teach the curriculum in English? If you actually want them to work in a multinational company or you want them to start running an administrative office, why aren't you teaching them that kind of English instead of teaching a science lesson in English? So this seemed to us that that was a more sensible approach. And we got the very clear message that Save the Children and other agencies were actually doing a lot of damage by not coming out and talking about language, that there had been too much silence about the bad practice that was going on. So from 2007, we started a new approach by promoting within our programme teams the idea of a continuum of good practice, that you start where you are and you try to encourage baby steps forward. You don't say to your Ministry of Education, your school system is a failure, you have to completely change it, you have to use a mother tongue-based multilingual approach. You actually say, well, what are the opportunities for making small changes along a continuum so that you get to good practice eventually? And the idea is that you want your basic education system to use the familiar language of the child as the foundation for learning, but also introducing ways of learning second languages. You're never going to be proficient in English by the end of primary school if you live in rural South Sudan, but you might get a sense of how you can increase your English learning capacity later on if you have the right kind of teaching. So that was our kind of goal we were working towards. And we decided we were going to kind of work with governments that were serious about equitable growth, that actually did want to see spreads across the whole country of benefits from education. And they were serious about having stability and not creating divisions between the people who had English and the people who had the national language and the people who didn't. So with those governments and officials and groups of education management, we started to point out the contradictions of where their policy was taking them and saying, well, if you want equitable growth, all the evidence says that your current approach is not going to give you that. So we produced a report called Steps Towards Learning, which really just distilled down all the evidence that we could find in terms of what wasn't working, what was working, and some practical advice for difficult circumstances. What do you do if your teachers don't speak English? What do you do if you have 3 mother tongues in your classroom? And just some useful strategies for the middle-level district education officials to help them over this gap between not being able to do good practice, but knowing what they were doing wasn't working. We then did the Missing Link Policy Report with CFBT, and this was really aimed at donors to kind of identify why language should be talked about in education aid circles, and really saying there's a link between the divisions in your society, and those divisions can be based on access to dominant language, and there's a link between that and conflict and instability. And also it's a bit of a waste of money to be investing in teacher training and not training those teachers how to take a good approach to building language up in children's education. So that was something we felt was a gap. We then did some action research in Vietnam, Bangladesh and India, where we were doing a lot of work at the school system level to try and shift approaches, to see what the blocks were to moving towards a kind of multilingual school system. And we also joined a lot of international groups, set up networks, engaged with a lot of different agencies to try and get the messages out there and try and create more presence for language within education discussions. Some of the things we learned, I won't go through them in details, but they're all in. There's a CD just on that table. There's a few copies, some of the learning. Things like, particularly in Vietnam, having minority teaching assistants planning their lessons with qualified teachers so that you had a person in the classroom who spoke the children's language, who was working in tandem with a qualified teacher to produce a bilingual lesson. And we particularly liked SIL's approach of actually advocating in South Sudan to reuse a lot of the multilingual materials that were dormant from before the war that hadn't been used. So we tried to pull together learning on practical ways to move your school system to a more multilingual approach. And some of the learning we had, design your interventions around the aspirations and fears that people have for language. There's no point just saying this is what the evidence says about good technical practice. You have to shape your programme around what people's worries are around language. So for example, in Vietnam, we said this programme is called Vietnamese Through the Mother Tongue. We didn't say this is a mother tongue-based multilingual education programme. We said children will be better at Vietnamese, it's just that the method is a bit different. The method was mother tongue-based multilingual education as much as possible, but the focus was on the children learning Vietnamese. Again, with people who are really interested in equity, remind them that there's a trade-off. If you want to actually have equity, often you need to take it more slowly, you need to roll out your policy in a more considered way. You can't just say, we're going to make sure that everyone's learning in English from next week, because only the people who already speak English will do well in that context. So we're trying to give people a sense of what it means to have an equitable system. And again, this came up, I think, previously today. The conflict of choosing one particular local language, particularly in some of the sub-Saharan Africa countries we were working in, of saying we're going to choose this group's language as the language of instruction instead of English, causes a great deal of problems about who who is in charge and who is disadvantaging another group. However, there's still a principle that children won't learn well unless they are learning in a language that they are already familiar with. So we had to at least just bring those two things to play in decision making so that people were able to weigh those two things up rather than just not being aware of this need for familiar language when you're teaching. And with all our programmes starting to sort of work on easier opportunities and continuing, not just saying we're going to have a job done in 2 years. So in Vietnam again, we weren't able to do literacy work in local language because that was seen as too politically sensitive, but we did lots of other things to demonstrate that the changes we were making were possible to get better learning outcomes. But the literacy work is on the list to be working on when the opportunity arises. And again, showing lots of demonstration of what a multilingual classroom looks like to people from the capital city and from the Ministry of Education. Lots of studies to show the improvements in learning outcomes. And something we didn't do, but we should have done, is addressing the examination system. So in Bangladesh, we had a situation where we'd done lots of fantastic teacher training on multilingual approaches, and then they had the primary school exams at grade 5, and they were just completely panic-stricken, the teachers, because they had to get these kids to take an exam in Bangla, not in the indigenous language, and they felt those kids were going to fail that exam. So the motivating power of the assessment system on teachers is something which we didn't take into account and which we couldn't really act on. I think if we were doing this again, we would start with the testing system and look at how important that is for what teachers do. And in India, there's certainly been a lot of progress made on having local language exams and translating exam processes and texts into local languages to allow bilingual and mother tongue examinations. And again, this sort of fear of kind of what do you do about multiple mother tongues where you have a large primary school with several different ethnic groups, that was often used as a kind of reason not to do anything at all. And so we would push through that and say, well, okay, let's find different ways of doing it. There's lots of things we can try, but let's not do nothing, because having English when nobody speaks English and nobody has access to TV or radio is not going to work. So that was something which came up a lot and we felt we had to work through. So we then disseminated a lot of these reports, brought language into our literacy work, into our programme networks, and engaged in lots of different conferences. We also did a video kind of outside the expert arena, which was really distilling down some of the messages on good practice and a couple of Guardian articles. Some of the results, we had recognition in Vietnam about the value of the bilingual team teaching approach, and that was scaled up. Again, in Bangladesh, mother tongue bilingual education for minorities was adopted into the education sector plan. And the DFID and World Bank education sector strategies recommended first language-based education. So not just previously people have been saying, well, it's a good idea to have mother tongue for the early years, but not recognising that you need mother tongue for much longer than that. And again, showing strong evidence of having bilingual literacy approaches where children are doing a lot better in the Save the Children literacy work when they don't speak the language of instruction. And again, one thing we particularly wanted was to see donors actually requesting bilingual approaches and mother tongue approaches in their tendering requirements, to actually bring that into the centre of their accountability for education aid. So in 2011, we started to see more DFID tenders actually saying we want first language teaching, we want multilingual teaching, and we were very pleased about that. Some of the things which we felt still challenging, this idea of support on how best to choose and implement your policy. And for me, it really comes down to asking the question, the language you want to promote, how present is that in people's daily lives? If it's not present in people's daily lives, there's no point using that language as a language of instruction, and starting the dialogue with policymakers on that basis was something we felt was quite important. I think this has come up already, but good language practice is not yet covered in training for learner-centred teaching. So you'll have all this work with teacher training colleges and teacher training regimes to get them using learner-centred approaches, but there's not really anything on what a good primary school teacher should do to help children develop their mother tongue and develop the skills to learn new languages. And a real issue is there isn't really anything within the English language teaching community about how you teach English and other second languages to children who don't have access to those languages outside school. So what kind of criteria should you use for developing your English books? What kind of criteria should you use for doing classroom testing and examinations? What kind of levels of vocabulary do you want to use? How do you build concepts in relation to the concepts children already have in their first language? And I think this has already been raised. It's a massive, massive kind of gap within the English language teaching community. And for me, this is where the British Council could do a lot of good. So, further information. These are details of where the various reports and the video and things like that can be gained. And this is my contact details in case anyone needs to get in touch.